Welcome to the Swine Health Black Belt Podcast, the latest swine health research digested for you. My name is Dr. Clayton Johnson, and I'm your host for today's episode. Joining me on today's episode is Dr. Fabio Vannucci, Associate Professor at the University of Minnesota. Dr. Vannucci, thanks for joining us. Would you like to give an introduction to the audience?
Thank you, Clayton, for the introduction. And yeah, I am Fabio Vannucci. I'm a faculty member of the University of Minnesota since 2015 here at the Diagnostic Lab. And I'm happy to talk to you, Dr. Clayton, and share some of the experience that we have been doing here with PCV-3.
Excellent. Well, let's start with kind of hitting the main points of PCV-3, Fabio. Could you tell us a little bit about the viral agent involved and then the associated disease syndrome that can be seen in pig populations?
Sure. So let's start in what we know, which is the PCV-2. So it's a virus that are different from the PCV-2, but it belongs to the same family, if you will. So trying to make the same analogy with PCV-2, so you can find PCV-3 endemically on the swine population, which means that most of the PCV-3 positive PCR does not represent a disease associated necessarily. So I think that's a good lay down point that we can start discussing the PCV-3 associated disease. So if you are thinking more about clinical syndrome, there's not much in terms of a specificity or nothing specific about the PCV-3. I mean, kind of the same for the PCV-2, right? You can have a variety of clinical syndromes for PCV-2, kind of the same for PCV-3, general wasting, post-weaning, or finishing, depending on where you go. You can have, depending on the case, sudden death and so forth. So there isn't any specific about that. For PCV-3, if you're looking for trying to diagnose that, I would say a couple main bullet points for paying attention would be myocarditis or lesions on the heart, right? And if you don't have the heart submitted to the diagnostic lab, you can extrapolate that and looking for a specific term on the pathology report, which will be vasculitis. That can be either on the heart or other organs. Interstitial pneumonia is another thing that kind of, I'm going to the top from the top to the bottom, kind of the most common ones that we see in PCV-3 associated disease. So myocarditis, vasculitis, interstitial pneumonia, which is kind of viral pneumonia, and abortions are the other type of syndrome that we see associated with PCV-3. Is CT values important, right? That's another point for PCV-2. So not most of the positives are not representing disease, but when I should look at the CT values on the PCR results, and that will depend on the context that you're looking at. So if you are looking at chaotic clinical case where you have from 𝗟𝗏 to 𝗵𝗃𝗃, the former 𝗵𝗃, and everything else, E. coli and salmonella. So perhaps the CT values may not be important if you're looking at cases that are only a respiratory syndrome or sudden death with a low CT of PCV-3. So you look at that different, right, as you interpret the PCR. But the basic point is the lesions, right? You want to see some of the lesions that are more commonly associated with PCV-3. I'm just kind of going around some of the questions that I think the practitioners might think about as they go about the PCV-3 cases. How frequent is that? For our shop here, I would say mostly sporadic. We do see in a scenario of outbreaks here and that, but it's not a massive outbreak that I mean, compare with PRRS and others that goes about that. It's more like sporadic cases that can solve by itself sometimes, and there isn't at least that I'm aware of any typical traditional commercial vaccines available. We do see people working with RNA technology for vaccination of PCV-3. Other than that, I haven't seen anything more specific related with the control. Yeah, so I think those are the main points. And I'm happy to answer any questions you may have, Clayton.
Fabio, on the diagnostics, you mentioned myocarditis as being a lesion that's commonly seen. In my experience with PCV2, we see the myocarditis a lot of times in neonates, even in unborn fetuses or very, very young piglets. Is that similar in PCV3, that's kind of the population that seems predisposed to the myocarditis, or do you see that in pigs of all ages with PCV3?
Yeah, good question. No, in PCV3, it's a bit different. We see in pretty much all ages. I would say mostly nursery pigs.
Okay.
Wasting nursery and let's say first week of nursery, or perhaps even the, how do you call it, peri or pre-weaning, that age. Sometimes we got submissions that these 2 pigs are from at weaning and those 2 others are 1 week after weaning. So, and we see on that age too. So, and when we first actually started seeing that, and that's another lesion that are more close to the PCV3 in terms of looking at pathology of that, would be a very, very bad PERS. When you got a very bad PERS, you might end up with a myocarditis on that. And that's how it looks like at first. Well, in terms of looking at the lesions and the report, I would say a bad PERS would look like more a PCV3 than the classical PCV2 neonatal or stillborn type of pigs. Does that make sense?
It does, and when you read the histopath reports, a lot of times the lesions are general, like you're describing with PERS or PCV3, there can be multiple causative agents. And I know with PCV2, we've historically used immunohistochemistry or IHC to try and identify the pathogen in the lesion, just kind of find the criminal at the scene of the crime, so to say. With PCV3, as I understand it, it's more in situ hybridization. As I understand it, that's the same goal, but a different assay. Could you kind of compare and contrast a little bit IHC versus in situ hybridization? What's the difference in the tests? Should we interpret them any differently? Give us in kind of the layman's terms, why do we use in situ hybridization for PCV3? And then what can we do with those results? What do they mean if it's positive or negative?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. But before we got there, I want to mention something that might be important. One of the classical and typical things that we see that we used to see in the report, you guys used to see in the report for PCV2 is lymphoid depletion, right? I think that's the most term that we have. And the PCV3, you may have that, but it's not necessarily something that are remarkable for PCV3. So I just want to lay that down before going to the assay. So IHC, the immunohistochemistry, and the in situ hybridization, the final goal is the same, which is, the scene of the cream, as you mentioned, identify the pathogen within the lesions. And they work differently, right? The IHC, you are looking for the protein. You are looking for the protein that virus produce while they are replicating within the lesions. And you stain the protein with antibodies, okay? And you do that for PCV2, for PERS and others. For the in situ hybridization, what you're doing that is identify a sequence, like a gene, that are expressing by the virus. So one is protein, the other one is a sequence. And so you can think as the in situ hybridization more like a PCR, because you're detecting the sequence. The difference from the PCR is that on some of the specific in situ hybridization, for example, for the PCV3 that we are working on, instead of detecting the DNA, that you may wonder, okay, I'm not detecting the virus replicating, I'm just detecting dead virus, for example. In the case of the PCR. In the case of the in situ hybridization, because we are targeting specifically mRNA or gene being expressed, so the interpretation would be, okay, we are looking at a virus, that's a term that I'm going to throw away right now, metabolically active virus, which basically means virus being active on the lesions. They are active, they're replicating there because they are producing the gene, right? That's I don't want to go too deep on that, but that's the basics of the things. Hope I was clear now.
Yeah, very good. So for me as a practitioner, if I see that the in situ hybridization is positive, I can assume that the virus is not only there, but likely live because it's replicating. Like you're saying, it's active within those cells.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Very good. So we've talked about kind of the clinical signs, the diagnostic assays to prove or disprove whether we have the disease or not. What do you see right now for prevalence on cases coming into the diagnostic lab? We've been talking about PCV-3 for probably 5 years now. Are we seeing the number of cases go up, or have we kind of plateaued and hit a bit of a steady state with the percentage of the cases that you guys get that you're saying, oh, PCV-3 is a problem for this farm?
Yeah, I would say the short answer for that would be the plateau. I think, from my perspective, would be more of the plateau. So we won't be in a truly emerging and cases coming in increasingly. I would say in the last year or so, or even the 5 years. But I always think about the PCV-2, right? History of that, right? I mean, how does that it was. Suddenly, it was a plateau thing, so I always trying to compare that, and it was instead increasing on the PCV-2 history, if you will. I mean, we had one or 2 years that we had a really boom on that, but so far it doesn't seem as even close that we had in the early days of PCV-2 where we didn't have vaccine, right?
Yeah,
I'm talking about 2002 probably, somewhere there.
Yeah. I think it's important that we keep an eye on this pathogen, even if it has plateaued right now. As we have learned painful lessons in the swine industry, pathogens can emerge and reemerge and change with time. So we may be plateaued today, but that doesn't mean that tomorrow can't be different.
Agreed.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Vannucci. Really appreciate you coming on to the podcast, and to everybody out there in our audience, thank you for listening to the Swine Health Black Belt podcast. Please do visit us at swinehealthblackbelt.com, and don't forget to subscribe to our podcast so that you won't miss out on the next episode. Thank you very much for joining us, and see you next week.
Hey everyone, we're always searching for the latest and greatest research to share each week. If you have a swine health-related research trial and would like to come on the show to talk about it with me and share it with our audience, feel free to send an email to healthblackbelt@swineit.com, and we would love to take a look at your research.